Hi, my name is TJ. My dad died of overdose on January 1st, 2011, and my mom is a recovering addict. God helped my mom, and now together we are here to help you. Now let's talk recovery. Here's your host, my mom, Susan Sexton-Wood.
Hi, and welcome to Let's Talk Recovery. I am your host, Susan Sexton-Wood. Today we have a special guest, two of them, Tom and Wendy Cannon. They run Crossroad Rehab for Women, and I am actually a product of Crossroad. I was in the facility in 2012, and I can tell you that changed my life. Welcome, Wendy and Tom.
Thank you. Appreciate you having us.
We're going to ask them to share their testimonies and how they come to be. You're a missionary at Crossroad. And so, can you share with us your testimony? Tom,
I can.
You want to go first?
I guess I'll start. I was born locally, raised here locally. My parents divorced before I started kindergarten, so my mother and my sister and I moved from Richmond to Centerville. About the 5th grade, we moved to the other side of Centerville, and that's when my connections and friends changed. I was raised in a church of believers, but they didn't go to church. If I went to church, it would have been staying the weekend with my grandmother, go to church with her and keep my uncle awake, but was never really involved in church. And when we moved to the other side of town, my friends changed, as I said. The friends that I started associating with had a head start on me in experimentation. My mother was then a working mother, and so supervision was rather minimal, and I was allowed a lot of freedom. And so I started experimenting with the things that my friends had already started experimenting with. Started smoking cigarettes at an early age. By 7th grade, had tried marijuana and certain pills. And that just continued to be a pattern of excitement, of recreation, of staying connected with friends and hanging out and doing the things that they wanted to do. Because as we grow up, of course, we want friends and we want to be connected to them and feel like we fit in. 8th grade, it continued more experimentation. My mother had alcohol in the home. Never saw my mother under the influence, but because it was in the home, it was accessible. And our family was a family that would get together on big holidays, a large family, and alcohol was usually a part of that. It was always kept in check, but the family drank. And so I continued experimenting. By the 9th grade at Centerville's, where I went to school, I was doing LSD. I'd eat 2 hits of acid in the day at school. I remember one class that I came into, and the teacher looked at me and realized that I was not in any condition to do the presentation that I was scheduled to do that day in class, and she said, "That's all right, Tom, we'll get to you another day." And the pattern of my drug experimentation and my drug use was one where the consequences never quite seemed to catch up to me quick enough to cause me to want to make a change or to need to make a change. My mother had remarried. She married a functional alcoholic. He would work at the factory, get off, go to the bar, bring a 6-pack of beer home. It would be in the refrigerator. And so that was part of the family. She ended up divorcing him, and in about the 10th grade, she remarried a fellow that was in the United States Army. We then relocated from this local area to Savannah, Georgia. And it was very easy to fall right into the same pattern because I sought out the same types of friends that were doing the things that I was interested in doing and had been doing. One particular English class in Savannah, I brought in a pint of whiskey in my coat pocket and drank it in fourth period English class. That campus, you were allowed to smoke cigarettes right outside the door, so that meant you could smoke pot in the parking lot. And we were down there a little over a year, came back to this area. Spent some more time at Centerville High School, and by the 11th grade, my junior year, I had the opportunity to experiment with IV drugs, and anything that we could put in a spoon and break down, we would shoot it up. Again, consequences didn't seem to catch up with me too quickly. We ended up moving to Texas. Same thing, same pattern of friends, more experimentation. The drinking age in Texas was 18, which was very convenient. We then went to Schofield Barracks, Hawaii, and everything they say about Hawaii is true. The food's amazing, the scenery is beautiful, and the drugs are excellent. And after graduating high school, before going over there, living still on base with my stepfather and my mother, he said, you're either getting a job or you're going to college. So I got a job and was always able to work from that point. I was always able to hold a job and make good money. They left and came back to this part of the country a year and a half later. And I stayed 2.5 more years of living over there on my own with friends and working hard and partying hard. And that's when I had the chance to experience heroin. And over there they called it China White. And it was high quality, high purity. I would say my favorite 2 drugs was good pot and good cocaine. But I had the opportunity to do heroin. The first time I did heroin was in the business that I was working to become a manager of, and I smoked it off a piece of foil, for those that know anything about using. And the second time I used a needle. And it's really amazing looking back, the way that the Lord has carried me through things that could have been fatal. Because my drug use with cocaine, if you're experienced in that, you would typically use a lot more cocaine than you would heroin. So the change to the quantity of heroin, I can't understand how I survived that, because I was a novice. I remember waking up one morning while my parents were still over there in the bedroom on base, to my mother looking at me. And when I opened my eyes, she's standing there looking at me, and there's 3 syringes and a spoon and heroin laying next to me. And for 3 days, she didn't speak to me. When she finally chose to say something to me, she asked me what she did, where did she go wrong to cause me to do those things that I was doing. And of course, as an addict, the answer is, Mom, you didn't do it. It wasn't you. It wasn't the way you raised me. It was my own choice to go down that path. And that path starts gradually, as I've explained, and we end up going farther than we ever hoped to. So the experience of heroin was enough to show me what the high was like and also what the sick was like. I often, in the work that Wendy and I do, speak to groups and to families and parents, and they can't for the life of them understand why someone would use heroin. And I use this explanation. Many of us have heard stories of people that had near-death experiences, and they usually say something along the lines that I was floating out of my body, and I was up here in the room, and I could hear everything that was going on and see everything that was going on, but I couldn't interact. And that's how I describe the heroin high. It's an out-of-body experience. You're floating, but you're aware.
Right.
That's what it's like. And does that work? That's a good definition.
Yeah,
it's an out-of-body experience, and once you've gone there and done that, that's the ultimate. That's what you tend to lean towards after that. When my family came back, I stayed 2.5 more years. I ended up coming back to this part of the country. Went to work in the Cincinnati area. Like I said, I've always been able to hold a good-paying job. My drug use continued. I would come up to this part of the country and hang out with my friends and party on the weekends and go back down there and work, and that was essentially still my life. Ended up moving to this area, back up into the Richmond area, got a good job here in town, and that was my pattern. Had an opportunity to take over a restaurant up in Fountain City. For those local people here, it was called the Newport Inn Restaurant. And I had worked at a local business, a factory, had a great job for 2 years, and I went up and took over this restaurant for 2 years. And during that period of time, my drug use continued. I was spending money on things that I shouldn't have been spending money on, having access to cash in a daily business such as that. I ended up needing to close the restaurant after 2 years. And the wheels started falling off the wagon, so to say. I started having consequences for the life I had been living. I had married, we had a small son, my marriage was in shambles. Some of this is pretty personal. I had been cheating on my wife with a waitress. I had been spending money where I shouldn't have been. Earlier that last fall, I had the state come in because I owed taxes. And the lady said, I can shut you down right now, but if you write me 6 post-dated checks for $2,500 and then continue to pay your taxes as you should, we'll leave you alone. Well, I closed my restaurant before the last two tax checks cleared. After closing the restaurant, I worked to get my previous job back, a good factory job here in town. And I was coming back from Richmond to Fountain City, and an overwhelming voice led me to turn into a driveway where a house was being built. It was on a Monday morning. I had talked to this company and they were going to hire me back, but it would be about 6 weeks. And so there I am without a job, with a family, shambles all around me. And I turn into this driveway on a Monday morning, and I get out and I approach the two carpenters that are working there and ask them if they need someone temporarily, that I was in between jobs. And it just so happens, they said they had a third employee that broke his wrist over the weekend, and they were one man short. So go home, get lunch, come back, we'll put you to work today. And I approached those carpenters that afternoon as in a mindset that carpenters work by day, they drink by night, they do the same things I do, and cuss like sailors probably. And that's how I started my first day with them, and it didn't take very long to realize that they weren't cussing. And the things that I thought was funny, they didn't necessarily think was quite so funny. Well, come to find out, these were two Christian carpenters, go figure. Jesus was a carpenter. And they started sharing with me some things that I didn't understand about the Lord. One of these men was a recovering addict himself. And he had long hair, had a beard. He looked like a biker, to stereotype. And he rolled up his sleeve one day and he showed me huge craters all down his arms. He was a recovering Dilaudid addict. And the Lord had saved him from that. And as they ministered to me and shared with me what Christ had done in their lives, I came to understand that he could do it in my life. And about 2 weeks into this temporary job, I accepted Christ in the middle of that house that was being built, and my world changed. And it's been said by many others, I had a one-step recovery program. His name's Jesus. A lot of things changed very quickly. I had filed for divorce. I called my attorney, asked him to stop that. I wanted to try to reconcile my marriage. And I did that for almost a year, and we did end up in divorce. The lady that I was cheating on my wife with, it was as if she just vaporized. She disappeared from my radar, from my thought, from my heart immediately. There was no last phone call. There was no last visit. She just went away. And I did get my job back at this company here in town. I haven't had a needle in my arm since that period of time. That was May of 1991. That's when I accepted Christ. One of the gentlemen that was working there, he bought me my study Bible, which I still carry today. I read it cover to cover. I came to a full understanding of God's grace and mercy and what salvation means. And I know I'm saved, and that doesn't mean that I'm perfect. And so I started trying to live that, get my job back in town. And on my way into this first day on my old job, I smoked a joint on the way in. And I walked in there and they did the paperwork and I clocked in and they said, "Oh, Tom, by the way, we've started drug testing. So we'd like you to go down and drug screen for us. We know we didn't test before when you were here, but we do that now. So would you have a problem doing that?" And I said, "No, I'll go drug screen for you." And I do that, and a couple days later, they call me in the office. "Well, Tom, you didn't make it, but we'll agree, if you'll agree, to drug screen you randomly over the next period of a few months, and if you stop smoking weed, we won't have any problems." And I share this with you and your audience as an example of how when we come to a knowledge of Christ and we accept Him into our life, and we make the turn and start living the path that He wants us to be on, He will help us clean up our mess.
Yes, He will.
He'll help us clean up our mess. We can leave so much wreckage behind, and we can't fix it on our own. It's not possible, but the Lord can help us work through it. And He started showing me that right off the bat. in the response of this company to my positive drug screen. A couple months later, I got notice from the State Department of Revenue that I had a big problem, and they asked me to come to their office, and I walk into the Provost Marshal's office of the Indiana Department of Revenue, which is the enforcement officer, and he pulled out those 2 checks that I had written a while back for $2,500 each and says, I can call you and have you put in jail right now for check deception. And he told me he'd give me 10 days to come up with $5,000, or he would put out a warrant. Oh no, what do I do? I went to the office where I am now working again, and I explained my problem. They said, well, Tom, we'll write you a check for $5,000, and we'll start taking it out of your check a little bit at a time.
Wow.
What company does that?
Right.
That was God showing me that He's got this. If you just keep pursuing me, I'll help you fix it. And made a lot of changes since then in my life. Of course, I quit smoking pot, and I continued to grow. I didn't attend a church. I tried 2 or 3 different churches back at that time, but I was what you would call a closet Christian. And I was confident in my salvation and felt that that was really all I needed. And I cleaned up my language. I cleaned up a lot of things in my life. And worked for 7 more years for that company, and then went out on my own as an electrical contractor. And in 2008, I got a phone call from a lineman from Duke Energy. We had had a relationship in the electrical field together, and there was a problem at a house in Economy. It happened to be the parsonage, and this lady's lights were having electrical issues, and it wasn't on the utility company, it was on the homeowner's side of things. So he asked if I could come up and check it out for her. And the phone call came in about 8:30 on a Sunday night. It was March the 9th of 2008. And so I told him I'd be up, and I walked right in the front door of this beautiful lady who's now my wife that Sunday evening. And I asked her to marry me 9 days after that. And she said yes. And as she would say, the Lord led me right through her front door. And we were married in May of 2008, and because she at the time was a United Methodist pastor, pastoring 2 churches, I immediately started going to church. Of course, 2 churches every Sunday, 2 sermons. And the Lord started giving me a spirit of willingness to get involved in the work of the Lord. I started doing various things in the church, everything from cleaning up and unlocking and sweeping off the sidewalk and shoveling the snow to being the liturgist, and ended up being in the pulpit occasionally. And I really started to grow in my faith, which is really important. Closet Christians, they need to get busy. They need to get out in the church and get busy and start serving Christ. And in about 2012, and I don't want to step on your story, Wendy became involved in the ministry of Crossroad Christian Recovery Center for Women. And I know that's a mouthful, but that's the title of the outreach mission that we are a part of, Crossroad Christian Recovery Center for Women. That's on the screen. Hey, look at that. And this ministry is actually an outreach of the Shepherd's Way Christian Ministries, which was founded in 2002. But we decided that we would be back serving the Lord in a different fashion, and here we are together, and God is good.
Yes, He is.
I did a lot of nasty things in my addiction, stole from family, and just all kinds of wreckage. And I can say that God has relieved me of that shame and guilt. I still think about it occasionally. I know my sin is forgiven. He's forgiven me. And shame and guilt is one of the biggest hurdles that an addict has to overcome. And the Lord Jesus can do that for you. He can lift that weight. He can break those chains. And you have a chance at recovery.
That's good. Thanks for sharing.
You're welcome. I hope I wasn't too long-winded.
No, that's fine. Wendy, would you share with us just some of your testimony and how you were led to the ministry?
I can. I was raised by my grandparents. My mother had passed away when I was 15 months old. And that started a period where I was kind of transitioned from home to home for a short time. And then when I was about 8 years old, I finally landed at my grandparents and was there until I turned 18. And I don't know if it was a transitioning, but I always grew up thinking low self-esteem. Some people might call it shy, some people might call it being an introvert, but just a feeling that I wasn't good enough. Struggled with fitting in. Some of that I think was transitioning from school to school at a young age. And so I fell into that group of rebellion, the kids that maybe weren't doing everything that, right, and had access to alcohol, to tobacco. Smoked my first cigarette probably at the age of 11, and when it was available, would drink. Smoked my first joint at age 13 with a cousin of mine, and just continued that pattern. If it was available, I would partake. I wouldn't say no. Mm-hmm. And I think, though, my primary addiction has been relationships and men, because I was looking to fill that void in my heart, and I always felt unloved, so I was looking for a way to fill that, for somebody to love me. And when I started getting attention from boys, I liked it, and so that's kind of where I went with it. At age 18, I left home, and I got married, had my first daughter, and my substance use at that point wasn't, I'd quit everything when I was pregnant with my daughter, so, but after she was born, I divorced her dad, and that's when my partying really started, drinking a lot, and at the age of 21, my life started becoming unmanageable. I had met my son's father at that point in a bar, and when things were starting to get out of control, and I was really fearful of losing my daughter. And so I stopped using, I stopped drinking. My son's father at that time didn't, but I didn't have recovery. And then there was a period of time when my husband at that time, he was sober, but again, didn't have recovery. So we were just two dry drunks or dry drug addicts, trying to find contentment and happiness, and it was all bad. And when I was around 28, 29, I just didn't want to live any longer. And I knew I needed help, and I didn't know how to get it. I knew I needed to go and talk to someone, but I was afraid to. And I just prayed to God, and I just said, God, you got to do something in my life, because I can't keep doing this. And God began to work a miracle in my life. And he began to put people in my life that would come alongside of me, and he gave me courage to step out. I had a lot of social anxiety, so for me to go to a small group Bible study was very challenging for me. But I knew I had to do something different because I couldn't keep doing what I was doing. And I think finally at that point, I said, I got to work on me and kind of let my husband do his own thing for a while. And so I did a couple of things. I was invited to a small group Bible study, and I stepped out and did that. And somebody invited me to join a bowling league with them. Never bowled in my life. That was challenging. But those were two things that I just felt like I needed to do. And through that, God brought a pastor into my life that counseled with me on issues that I felt. He helped me to understand why I did some of the things I did, why I felt some of the ways I felt. And that's the point in time when I really started feeling like I started getting into recovery. I started figuring out who I was, why I did the things I did, and that there was hope. And when that started happening, God put a call in my life to help other women figure that out. And that was, again, that was about 20 years ago. So God did a lot of training me up. And then one of the things that I did, I was working at Warnley Children's Home, and that's where I met Karen Rose, the founder of Crossroad Christian Recovery Center for Women. And she was a therapist on the unit that I was a child care worker on, and that's the first contact that we had made. And she left there before I did, and it was probably 15 years before I saw Karen again. And Tom and I were married by that time, and we ran into them at a church service, and they had brought the women from Crossroad to hear a speaker give his testimony. And I told Tom, I said, I know those people. And they asked during that church service for prayer for God to bring along a couple that they could train up to take over the ministry, because they were getting old and tired, and they knew that they needed help. And I teasingly said to Tom, do you think that's something we could do? Because I knew when God brought us together, I immediately recognized his gifts from ministry, and I really felt like God brought us together to be in ministry together, not just to be married, but to be in ministry together. And so I talked to Karen after that. She invited me to come out and teach. At that time, I was pastoring 2 churches, and immediately fell in love with the ministry, fell in love with the transformation that was happening in these women's lives, because they were coming to an understanding of who they were in Christ. And that's the calling that God had put on my heart 20 years ago.
That's amazing.
And like Tom said, when you start walking and being obedient to God, he trains you up and walking in your calling. And you can probably testify to this, Susan. There's no better feeling than walking in that calling God has on your life.
And just listening to you say, God started working in your heart that 20 years, I get excited about it. It's not a nervousness of getting older. It's exciting to know that I'm going to get older, but it's the longer with God and in the walk that he has me in. So it's an exciting thing. But we want to thank you for being on the show. Thank you for sharing your testimonies. Very powerful, and with what God's doing in both of your lives. I know I get to see just the continued growth of the ministry that you're a part of, and I would not be who I am without it. So I want to thank you for just dedicating your lives to the will of God and what he has for your life. I want to just encourage anyone out there that may be struggling to reach out for help. They are a part of an inpatient women's Christian recovery, and if you need help, just call the number on the screen, and we will be here to answer that call and to